1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The killing of George Floyd and similar tragic incidents have widened the racial divide in America and caused national unrest. At the same time, they've opened up a bigger conversation around the world about structural and systemic racism that exists today. They've brought some of the critical issues of our times, from implicit bias to negative stereotypes, and far worse, to the forefront of our consciousness. I'm Judith Brown Clarke, Chief Diversity Officer here at Stony Brook University. In today's podcast, we are going to look at what Stony Brook is doing around campus and across disciplines to deal with these types of issues, to be accountable for change and growth with everyone playing a role, and to help ensure we provide a campus environment that is just, equitable, and tolerant. We will look at how these are enhancing our diversity plan. And we will get to hear from 3 distinguished panelists from our faculty who can give us insight into what is happening in the arenas of academics, frontline medical care, and procurement. We also learn about the barriers that they've had to break, both personally and professionally, as people of color to get to where they are today. Let's get to know them a little. Carmen Gonzalez is Stony Brook University's Assistant Vice President for Procurement. She has held U.S. and global supply chain roles in both the higher education and corporate sectors. As part of her role at Stony Brook, she leads the areas of minority and women-owned business enterprises and service-disabled veteran-owned businesses, which are integral components of our commitment to supplier diversity. It's how we ensure we not only have a diverse student and faculty population, but that we're giving our diverse vendors the opportunities to partner with us and thrive. Dr. Zebulon Vance Miletsky is an assistant professor of Africana studies and a historian specializing in recent African American history, civil rights, and Black power, urban history, mixed race and biracial identity in hip-hop studies. His research includes African Americans in Boston, Northern freedom movements outside the South, mixed race history in the U.S., and Afro-Latin diaspora. He is the author of numerous articles, reviews, essays, book chapters, and is currently working on a manuscript on the civil rights movement in Boston. Dr. Jedan Phillips is a family medical specialist and full-time faculty member at Stony Brook University, Stony Brook Medicine, where he treats patients and is involved in medical education and leading-edge research. Dr. Phillips is also serving as the medical director for Stony Brook Medicine's Home Outreach and Medical Education, or known as HOME program. This is a walk-in medical clinic for the uninsured and provides learning opportunities to medical students and health care to the community, a program that helps address some of the racial disparities issues in our current healthcare system. Just before we speak to each of them, I'd like to provide a little context on our diversity plan at Stony Brook University from a broad perspective and what we're doing now to bring our culture forward. I've sent out a couple of correspondence, and really it's looking at what the plan is. Back in 2015, there was a start of a lot of fingerprints. Let's say there's 1 million fingerprints on our diversity plan. When I first arrived at Stony Brook University, I did a listening tour, and I've done that for the last 4.5 months. And what I've heard is those key components are still relevant to the things that that people are identifying as challenges now. Here's the overarching goals that originated from the 2015 diversity plan. Number 1, improve the diversity of the Stony Brook community through enhanced recruitment and retention. 2, expand educational, research, healthcare, and other efforts to ensure that Stony Brook students have the ability to thrive as members of the campus community and as global citizens in a diverse society. 3, support the development of a campus climate that values diversity, equity, and inclusion in a way that promotes the ability of members of the community to thrive and to achieve their individual goals. And finally, 4, establish a culture of accountability and assessment through diversity and inclusion initiatives and policies. Obviously, those are still things that are relevant, and so we're lifting that plan off the page and implementing it into actionable items. Really quickly, we're using a theoretical strategy that is called collective impact, which is basically a problem-solving process that looks at continuous learning. This is where we're looking into our talent bank of every individual across our campus, including undergraduates, graduate students, postdoc faculty, staff, alumni, and external stakeholders to be part of the solution. There'll be performance measures and evaluation at each of those levels, which have us have the ability to really identify key outcomes and indicators which ensure that we are making meaningful change and differences and everybody understands their role. So that being said, I'm going to go to my guest. The first person I'm going to talk to today is Zebulon. Good morning, Zebulon.
Good morning.
Before we dig deeper in getting more specific, can you give your personal, your perspective of what's going on in America and the world today in terms of race relations and divides?
Yes, Judy, thank you. And thank you again for having me. Yes, I think all of us, this country and really around the world, have been sort of caught up and inspired and moved and really touched by some of the events which have been taking place lately. And, you know, sort of as a historian, of course, I tend to think of the historical context that led up to this moment. Nothing comes out of the blue. And so I think, you know, some folks are, you know, I think most people were really just struck by the cruelty, the inhumanity, and just the sheer abuse of power that we saw with this particular killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. But of course, it's not an isolated incident, and it's not the incident itself that has pushed folks out into the streets, has moved people to donate to causes, to support causes, to reach out. I myself have received so many emails from allies and other supportive folks. It's the number of things that led up to that, and I think, you know, in any society you have a tipping point, and it's just that straw that broke the camel's back, coming, you know, in a series of these incidents that have, you know, gone on too long and have shown people that there's something wrong in America. There's something wrong in our society when something like this can happen, where people stand around helpless or don't think that they have the right. That is to say, the other policemen who were involved didn't have the conscience, that conscious moment to intervene, and so it suggests something about the enormity of the problem, one that has gone on too long. And I think it says something about really the greatness of America, that there is, even in this climate, even in this time, there is still something in all of us that looks and sees that and says, that's not American. That's not, we're better than that. That's not who we are. And there'll always be those who, you know, differ in terms of perspective or political persuasion or what have you. But I think the vast majority of people are saying, that's not what America's about, and we're better than that.
I love that. I love that. I think people are trying to make sense of what this is, and how does it compare to, you know, you're a historian. So is there something that you can compare this to that gives us hope and maybe a blueprint of how to move forward?
Yeah, I think so. You know, it always seems like we're living in unprecedented times, but then that's where the historians pop up and say, oh, no, there were, you know, we have been through some of these things before. And it's kind of interesting because when you look at the sort of twin pandemics, if you will, the actual pandemic of COVID-19, but then this sort of racial pandemic that we're also seeing, if you will, and then really just the incidence of both of these things happening really are at the same time. Obviously, there's connections, but you know, it occurred to me about 100 years ago. You had in 1918 the flu pandemic, so-called Spanish flu pandemic that took place, and in 1919, about 101 years ago, you had what was known as the Red Summer of 1919. And in that time period, we saw some of the highest numbers of lynchings, of as they're often called race riots, but these were really pogroms in a sense, where you have people going in and using violence in black communities, really terrorizing black citizens. And so about 100 years ago, there was a march. People took to the streets to protest this kind of thing. And it's unclear. There's one thing I'm sort of still working on, is trying to find out, what was it like then to be protesting and speaking out against that kind of violence in the context of the pandemic of 1918. I mean, it must have had an impact. And so it's very interesting, again, how history can repeat itself. That was another time where people were essentially saying, they didn't use this term, but they were essentially saying Black Lives Matter, because unlike other eras in African American history or in American history, here was a time where the main issue was the destruction and the violence against black bodies in particular. This was the issue. This was beyond, you know, job discrimination, beyond Jim Crow or all the other maladies and ills or civil rights issues essentially that were on the table. This became, please stop lynching us. Please, not please, and it was a demand, but similar in a sense that a real kind of just defense of black life, essentially.
And as we're kind of unpacking what it is, I think it also begs the question is, what can it be? So as we start to move forward and as we're looking at, you know, grounding what we know and having it inform on how we move forward, talk about some academic plans that can be implemented with the university, and maybe some things, if you were the king of the world and you were able to really from a, you know, using the platform of history informing our future, what are some of the things you think that Stony Brook could do effectively?
Yeah, well, I think that, you know, credit is due for having begun this process, you know, before this point. I think that, you know, there'll inevitably be, and a lot of companies, we're seeing this with universities and colleges, are now, you know, genuinely, with genuine intention, trying to put together a so-called a diversity plan, or what are our contingencies, or they are they're doing things. I mean, you turn on Netflix and it says Black Lives Matter, Amazon, so kudos in a sense, you know, to Stony Brook for having started that process. And I think though, if we're being, you know, really truthful, a lot of us who worked on this diversity plan, including myself, because I was involved, you know, along as in the timeline that you laid out in the beginning, and then and indeed the whole university was involved with focus groups and all kinds of different things. I don't think though that people really understood the true value of this plan and what a diversity plan could be and can mean. And indeed, you had some folks who have, you know, sort of turned away from terms like diversity and so forth because they didn't think it was effective. Here's a chance and an opportunity to really, you know, lift the words off the page, as you said, to make good on those commitments and imperatives. These are, you know, these ought to be taken very seriously in terms of now implementation. We're past the planning phase. We did a great planning phase, and it was a comprehensive one, and it's been well, you know, very thorough. But I think now is time, you know, as they say, to put our money where our mouth is, and implement these kinds of things. You know, support is needed for certain offices and departments around campus that have been doing this kind of work for a long time. You know, my own department is a good example of that, the Africana Studies department. Nobody can do exactly what we do and can do and have been doing, and yet for a long time I think that's been very misunderstood. But you have to understand that, you know, in a society in which race is so prevalent and issues of race are so complicated and complex, you're going to have folks who will reject an Africana Studies department as being less than, or being, you know, something that's not worth their while or their time. And that includes African Americans. And so we don't worry about that. We know what we're doing, and we do our work with excellence, and we do it every day. What our students need right now is what Africana Studies, for example, does, which is nurturing, checking in. How are you doing? Transformative education, information that can be used to change things. We need support to do that. We need faculty lines to do that. We need, the support from the university to be able to really grow and flourish. If you go to any other campus in America, Harvard University, the hottest thing on campus is African American studies. Yale, Princeton, all the best campuses, all the Ivy Leagues. African American studies is the most important thing. Look at the professional organizations, the heads of the Urban History Association, the American Historical Association. They all work on race. If you look at their personal, their work. And
I agree.
So that's something we need to focus on.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
And something that you just said that actually takes us to our next guest, Carmen Gonzalez. And thank you for being here, Carmen.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm a firm believer that where you put your money is where you put your value. And what you are investing in gives a real strong vision and tangible look at your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of our conversation has been around students, faculty, and staff when we strive to meet those requirements. But we also do that within our vendors. Can you tell us a little bit more about the university supplier diversity standards?
Yeah, well, the Stony Brook University, being a state agency of New York, falls under the New York State Article 15A, where we are required to work on having diverse vendors. We have targets that we're meeting in all of our contracts. Article 15 and the following executive orders have targets of 20% back as of 2011, and from 2014, 30% of our state spend should be with diverse suppliers. Stony Brook's done pretty good there. I would say the last year we have had some challenges, but it definitely is part of how we look at all of our purchases. And on the Research Foundation, they also are following diversity requirements for their purchases, which are based on the contracts, the sponsors for their grants.
Fantastic. And how are we helping minority, women, veteran-owned businesses, small businesses, and the like building competitive portfolios so they can get these kind of contracts?
I think we all work with the New York State Empire State Development Office, which has a division of minority and women business enterprise folks up there who are helping to promote us using diverse businesses. They have outreach programs to help develop suppliers. And for us, having these requirements to use diverse suppliers encourages us as buyers to go out and work and find and source diverse suppliers. So we are actively doing that. And when we're going out and contracting, when we put out a request for purchase, we ask our suppliers to provide a utilization plan for any purchase that's over $50,000. So if we contract with a majority or private, publicly owned company, we're requiring them to give us a utilization plan because we want the second tier spend if we're not buying directly. The state's also given us more leeway to buy from diverse suppliers through some opportunities to do exclusive bids only for these diverse suppliers. For example, at Stony Brook, we do that for security guards. We did a sourcing project, and that's all of it was exclusively for diverse vendors, and that's one of the ways that we're trying to really hone and improve our relationships and the opportunities that providing diverse suppliers.
And what are some of the strategies? And you may have you've touched a little bit on this, but for example, where we post opportunities for like RFPs, RFQs, and so on, do we have or are there ways we can enhance our reach on where we post our contract opportunities?
The state guidelines are pretty rigid. So we post on the New York State contract reporter and that is where we post all of our solicitations. So that's what we're working through. The suppliers are also, diverse suppliers are getting certified through that the Empire State Development Office. They certify diverse suppliers for the state of New York, and then they also create a database where we can go out to find them. So that's really the main way. I think just as a strategy, one of the things that Stony Brook should look at is really incorporating supplier diversity more into the diversity action plan. Today, supplier diversity isn't mentioned in our diversity action plan at all, and it has huge benefits to the diverse communities when we buy from diverse suppliers.
I just heard an action item. And then one final question before we move to our next guest. Is there anything in the current environment that's fueling or accelerating any of our efforts in this regard?
I would say that one of the things I've noticed is definitely more consideration for who we're buying from. Supplier diversity is really all about how you spend your money, who you're buying from should reflect the people that you serve. So as we look at our student body, as we look at who's coming into our hospitals, we need to be trying to make sure that we're supporting all the communities that support us and actively trying to build more of a partnership with the minority business community. And I see that when we have a movement like we do right now, that this really activates people to look at more conscientiously who we're buying from and how we can make sure that we're spending our money in a way that's really going to make a difference and help the economic growth of minority communities.
Thank you so much. And then our final guest, Dr. Phillips, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's very difficult with direct patient care to even carve out the time to be here, and I really appreciate you.
Oh, no problem.
So tell us a little bit more about your healthcare background and the work you're doing in Stony Brook Medicine's Home Outreach and Medical Education program known as HOME.
Well, my medical background is I went to college at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, then went on and studied at University of Maryland Medical School. Initially, when I graduated, I thought I wanted to become a surgeon, so I did a couple years of general surgical residency, but I did not feel that it was fulfilling of what I envisioned as far as practice in medicine. As I told people, it was like having a nice pair of shoes, but they were a half size too small. So if you're wearing them every day, after a while, you start walking like your feet hurt. And that wasn't really a happy space. So in turn, I changed over to family medicine, which is when I came to Stony Brook and did my residency in family medicine. After I graduated, I was selected as staying on as a faculty member. And as far as my involvement with SB Home, I was always one who felt the issue and the mission of serving the underserved was important to me, because that was one of the initial impetus or stimulus for me becoming a physician. I came from a family where my parents cared about others and we saw them caring about others. My community, I mean, unfortunately, back in that time, racism still reared its head. We had to travel or be bussed out of our neighborhood to a local elementary school, which at times was very difficult. So there was a unity and a support that we all had for one another because of the fact that we were coming into hostile territory as we viewed it because of the reaction that we received. So that was always something that was in me. When I was here in 2007, students had approached me and asked me if I was interested in helping them, begin or develop a learning curriculum or activity that involved more community-based medicine and medical issues involving the underserved. And we sat down for a few months to sort of map out what we wanted to do. And then we went to the administration at Stony Brook and presented our idea. And so then SB Health Outreach medical education, or SB Home as it's more affectionately called, was born. And I've been involved with the clinic all the way through. I think what was said earlier about just the institution, supporting, because a majority of the opportunity and time that I give to Stony Brook Home is on my own time. I work there on the weekends. I laugh and joke with the students a lot, telling them how my wife understood that was part of the contract when we got married. Because of my interest in serving. So, Sundays where I gave to the clinic, and evenings and other times when I helped the students, she supported that. And I appreciate that greatly, because I don't think that it would feel as good as it feels now if I did not have that support at home.
One of the things that we have noticed, and there's been a lot of attention to, and that is how the COVID pandemic has really highlighted and shown a light on racial disparities in healthcare. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I am part of a leadership group in my fraternity, and we had a meeting last night, and I'm part of the Health and Wellness Committee, and our chairman talked about the statement that he heard previously in his medical career, which was how you take a tragedy or a poor event and make something good come from it. Now, I know the pandemic has been incredibly demanding, horrible, and it's had a lot of weight on communities of color. I think the thing that the pandemic has actually done in a blessing sort of way is it has caught people at a time when people were sitting still. And with people sitting still, I think we have now a captive audience, because these problems that have affected African Americans and underserved communities and communities of color are not new. I sit here as a person who has known about these issues all my life and have been able to navigate and reach this point in spite of those issues. You thought back when it was Hurricane Katrina that the images that we saw of the people that were affected would finally reach down, but it didn't. It took 8 minutes and 46 seconds on top of a pandemic for people finally to say, wow, this is horrible. And I think with that, the conversation as far as individuals that have been involved in the mission of improving health care and wellness for people of color, we were ready to talk about it, because it's been something that we have integrated into our practice all along. With my teaching, I always am one that is very, attuned to making my students aware of social determinants, because I very much recognize that some of the backgrounds of the people that are going into medicine are not always the same as individuals that they're treating. And sometimes you need to be educated on those potential blind spots that you may have. So I think that the pandemic has given us the opportunity and has given us a captive audience for people really to finally understand what is going on as far as the issues of healthcare disparities and how they impact individuals or people of color.
Well, if you're just joining us here, we're here today with Carmen Gonzalez, Dr. Zebulon Vance Miletsky, and Dr. Jedan Phillips, talking about our diversity plan in action on this special episode of Stony Brook University's Beyond the Expected podcast. I want to follow up and continuing with that, never waste a crisis. And there's some things that have really, and I think this may go really across just the health of the nation, but it's proven that higher comorbidities, and especially around Black and Brown Americans, what is the approach around awareness, lifestyle change? What can the medical community do to really address the environmental factors that lead to health issues or even death among certain segments of the population?
Well, I think the medical population has tremendous power in this capacity. I mean, unfortunately, the medical community has participated in some of the originating factors of racism, as far as some of the mindsets of physical, mental inequalities that they supposedly exist in people of color. So I think that is something that has been shown as far as the influence that the medical community has. I think one of the things that we can do at this current time, because these issues don't exist just because individuals are black. These issues exist because of these circumstances that people of color live in this country. I mean, you look at the issues of just recently with face mask, you know, how we're policing or mandating face mask in some communities versus others. You know, it's here, take a face mask in, you know, Central Park, but if you go in Brownsville and Brooklyn, it's a more aggressive interaction. So again, I think that the medical community can centralize or discuss how the issue of bias and institutional racism has impacted the communities of color and caused these undue burdens as far as these healthcare morbidities. You know, it is not by, you know, choice that people of color have less available medical care in their communities. It is not by choice that we have, you know, lack of facilities and services. It is not by choice that even with similar insurance status or economic status, that their medical research has still shown bias in how individuals of color are treated in comparison to their Caucasian brothers and sisters.
So the next course of questions, and I'm going to address it to each of you. So I'll tell you what it is so you can think about it before I come to you. But one of the things, and Zebulon, I'm going to come to you first, and this is around education. When you think about K-12 education, our students, basically the school shut down in March, sometime February, March, but March. They're going back to school end of August, September. What does that look like, considering for the last almost 6 months, for those, particularly communities that are black and brown and low socioeconomic, have not had free and reduced lunch. And we know there's always a summer learning gap. So you exacerbate that by having these additional months added to it and being in a home where you may not have the educational support to ensure that you got the last basic 3 months of your K-12 experience. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like and how Stony Brook can be a good neighbor in this?
Yeah, sure. Well, Stony Brook has been a great neighbor, as far as I understand, throughout this process. I mean, and that has made national headlines, and it's been very important. I have 2 kids myself, 2 boys, 9 and 4. And like many parents, I'm concerned and worried. And then we have the added kind of role. My wife and I are both educators. She's a high school teacher, and I teach Stony Brook. That can be interesting, has been interesting. But I think that, you know, from my perspective, I don't quite see how that works in the fall for a lot of people. The problem is basically fear, or confidence has not been instilled in parents and teachers, for that matter, and feeling confident enough to go back and be able to perform their job functions. Questions like school lunch, how does that work? How are all these things going to work? I know this because I also serve on the school leadership team of of both the school that they both go to. So I've been involved in some of these discussions, and they are not easy. Hearing all the information, the best, you know, reckoning that I could make of it is that, you know, I know the schools have been functioning sort of like as community centers, at least in the city. I live in Brooklyn, in Bushwick, and I think that that's a good way to think about things going into the fall, at least as a starting point, because there are a lot of children who, A, did not get the distance learning. You know, they just fell through the cracks, either because they didn't have the Wi-Fi or they didn't have the computers themselves, although the city, to its credit, did a really good job of distributing, from what I can tell. The DOE did a great job of distributing iPads and so forth. They might have got them a little later, but they did get them. And so that's a massive investment. I think that once you invest in distance learning in that way, it makes sense to try to probably keep it going. And if I had my druthers, I would this is a tough one because, it affects everyone differently. Some people have to work, they can't do it. And so I think in people in those situations, if the schools could function much as community centers with computer labs or areas in which they could do the distance learning at the school, get their school lunch, get something to take home with them, maybe after school, if that's a possibility, with a sort of reduced crew of educators and providers. I think that is a plan that makes sense to me, because otherwise we have a lot of work to do in terms of instilling that kind of confidence to be able to come back. But to your point, you're absolutely right. The time has been missed, and it's hard to really fully make that back up. But I think, looking maybe after Christmas, January, I think people will feel a lot better, perhaps, about sending their children to school. There is that inflammatory condition that's affecting children, and so it's of great concern to parents and teachers alike.
You're absolutely right, and I think that translates to even our Stony Brook undergraduates. The parents are still making those same choices, still having some level of influence, at least freshman and sophomore year, and it is a difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah.
I'm going to move to Carmen. And Carmen, one of the things I heard when I was coming into work the other day is that minority businesses, 40% of small minority businesses were either had filed bankruptcy or were close to filing bankruptcy. So when we think about supplier diversity and losing, or the number of minority-owned businesses that are really in a bad shape, what does that look like, and what can Stony Brook do as a good neighbor again, and being part of the solution?
That's a great question, Judy. I think that at times like these, we really need to rededicate our efforts around the small business and diverse business community to reach out. There's lots of organizations that are, and Black Chambers of Commerce, Asian Chambers of Commerce. There's so much that supports the diverse business community, and becoming much more of a partner with those organizations, I think, at a time like this is very important. Today, we kind of leave a lot of the leading on the diversity program with our state agency in Albany. And I see that there's a huge opportunity here at Stony Brook to try to really cultivate our own supplier base. We struggle sometimes to find diverse suppliers out here on Long Island at our location. But I think that the opportunity with what's happened in New York City, I think that those scrappy entrepreneurs who are trying to maintain their businesses are really seeking new customers, and we need to make sure that we're out there and they know that where we have opportunities, we are going to be supporting the diverse business community and partnering with them and to look for opportunities. So I see this as just a time where we need to be really much more active in making folks know that we want to partner with diverse businesses during this really challenging time.
Dr. Phillips, I'm worried. We're doing a lot of work around, returning to campus, how they come back. And I always add, it's how they come back and it's how they come back. We know that our students, our faculty, our staff, our colleagues are coming back immersed in chronic stress. And we know what the research is on chronic stress. And coping skills may not be as mature and as sophisticated. And so we may have issues around self-medication or things that are self-sabotaging and so on. From your medical perspective and advice, what things can and should we be doing now so that we're doing it in a way of thinking about how they come back?
Well, I think the first thing is, just making sure that you're trying to make it a safe situation. I think what was just mentioned earlier is key. I mean, if you look at some of the numbers in the areas where the cases are going up. There are individuals that are younger being hospitalized. So, again, yet another nuance of this virus that is really unsettling, which is younger people being affected. The other concerning thing is just the discipline that is required. I'm in my 50s, and it's kind of easy for me to stay home now. But when I was in my 20s, it was hard. And I see with friends that they have these battles, conversations, intense conversations with their children, just trying to make them understand of how to proceed safely. But everybody wants what they want when they want it. And that is something that we're battling against. And I understand, the economics of it as far as wanting to open up. So I think the first thing we have to do is make sure it's a safe situation. And that's still to be determined at this time in light of what's going on. In addition to that, I think the other part, which was mentioned earlier, is education of the safety steps, because I think because information or the lack thereof has been a major component of the stress and anxiety associated with this pandemic, being clear with information on how we're going to keep the children safe, how the children are going to need to participate in their safety, all of those things are going to be needed. I think another, as a family doc, one of the things that I'm big on is the whole idea of prevention is much more effective and less costly to us than reaction. I think advertising or pushing wellness to our students, and wellness in the shape of activities as far as their relationship with mental health and wellness, because again, I've been lucky, but I realize my circumstances and my family's circumstances are not everyone else's circumstances, and other individuals don't have the ability to social distance, or they're not in a home situation that's great. So they may be eager and ready to jump out of there. And unfortunately, with that type of unreadiness, you can put people in unsafe situations. So I think, again, making sure that this is a safe circumstance, making sure that we have run through what our process is of safety with ourselves, and then practice it, seeing it be effective, and then roll that out to our students coming back so they understand what they're coming back to and how they need to prepare themselves. And I think the last thing is a message of wellness to everybody, because this whole circumstance has given all of us a time to look in the mirror and say, hey, what can we do to make sure I don't feel this negative feeling I'm feeling right now again in the future? Because we don't have a cure, we don't have a vaccine, and we can't really say that this pandemic is gone. Yeah. So, but we still have to move on. And how do we move on in a safe way? And I think, as it was stated earlier, mental health is a underappreciated, under-recognized problem that is not just in communities of color, but in all communities, because of the stigma and the reluctance and the lack of availability of resources to support. So I think that we need to make sure that we have those systems and support mechanisms in a robust fashion in preparation for when the students come back to school.
I love that you said we need to destigmatize mental health. It's always seen as a weakness and something that shows that you don't have skills or capacity, when in actuality, many times it's chemical imbalance, or other times it's just really having a support network that can spiral out of control. So I do think those are some really key things that need to happen with these safe spaces across our university. And being present. We know the students that we work with, and we can tell when they're shutting down or doing things that are self-sabotaging. Those are our responsibility as kind of the gatekeepers of our community, and this includes our peers and colleagues too, of just being present and notice who is around you. Zebulon, I want to ask you a question. One of the things that has come up repetitively is increasing our faculty and staff. Well, having a hiring freeze, that's an easy way to shut that conversation down. But I always bring it up with, then what other things can we do? So can you talk a little bit about tapping into our, like in Africana studies and other talent banks across the university on finding ways to infuse it within the curriculum?
Yeah, sure. I'm really sort of like, my wheels are turning here just listening to my fellow panelists, and guests, and some of their thoughts and ideas. One thing that we used to have at Stony Brook, is my understanding, was a black faculty and staff organization, and I think it's continued in some form or fashion throughout the years. It's a nice thing, as Dr. Phillips was saying, kind of in a blessing kind of way with COVID. There are some silver linings. There are some things that came out of it that might have been unexpected, and one of them seems to me is people are coming together. They're connecting. You're connecting with folks you may not have even connected with before. And I think because people are sort of, moving not only with their minds but their hearts right now, and so that's a good thing. I think that we have a lot of resources already, in-house, in the midst of a hiring freeze, without, as you said, that we can draw upon. We have knowledge and wisdom. As I sit and listen today, some of these stories and information would be good to pass on. I've had other folks around the university that I've had occasion to meet come speak to my classes, for example. I'm writing a book about the civil rights movement in Boston. Dr. Phillips was talking about busing growing up. These are stories that more people should know about. And there's all different kinds of ways of teaching, especially in the discipline of Africana studies. It's actually part of our methodology. I see it that way, which is bearing witness, I call it. Giving testimony. It's an important part of African American culture. It goes all the way back to the oral tradition, which comes out of the continent of Africa itself. And so it's part of who we are. It's part of our culture. As you know, I come from a mixed race, biracial background, and so there's a lot to put together here and see what we can do to enhance, I suppose, some of the things that we already have happening. And I also think just unity at this time is such an important thing. We're seeing all the things that are happening in terms of race. Misinformation gets out there, and all kinds of reasons that we find to not come together. And I think more than ever, watching this younger generation, because so much of Black Lives Matter is really a millennial movement, and have an intergenerational dialogue and continue to do that, because that's part of some of the core parts of African American identity, culture. That is to say, having elders around, having folks around to talk to, from the youngest up to the oldest. It's very, very distinctive part of African American culture, whether it be in LA or Michigan or Boston or New York, down south, and other places, even in the diaspora or West Indies and so forth. That part remains a constant, and we need to build upon that.
Carmen, I know in the purchasing process that colleges, departments, and units, as they're looking at who they want to do business with, sometimes they have to get bids and so on. So if you were to do training for those individuals, can you tell us a little bit about what it would look like so it's a little bit more inclusive on just not going to the same people that you already know?
Yeah, I think that in order for us to really engage more with the diverse supplier community, we need our stakeholders to be the ones saying that that's who they want to work with. Because just like for the stakeholders, sometimes they will need education on where to find diverse suppliers. My own staff needs that sometimes too. So we need to challenge one another to figure out how do we find diverse suppliers. There's definitely avenues of doing that, and I think the biggest thing is that it shouldn't just be on the stakeholders to do that. It helps, obviously, when we have stakeholders who want to have a more inclusive supply base, because it's part of what we do. We have, obviously, as I said, we have numbers we're trying to meet, but it needs to be more than just numbers. And so training the folks here at Stony Brook is just, I think it's happening as the world is changing, that we need to be thoughtful about who we're buying from and who we're partnering with. And then we need to challenge one another. The procurement department needs to be more challenged. How do we find diverse suppliers? We have lots of tools and resources here in the state of New York, but there's a bigger world out there in beyond just the New York State and suppliers who haven't gone through the New York State process but maybe need to be encouraged. They're not certified diverse suppliers at this point, and that's where you really get into partnering with some suppliers to help them to grow so that they can go through the certification process so that they can build their businesses and get more opportunities. But I think a lot of it with the training is helping stakeholders understand just how powerful this can be to the economic growth of diverse communities and how every dollar that we spend can make a difference.
I really appreciate all of you. Dr. Phillips.
Yes.
The last 3 months were not taught in medical school. There's a lot of things that came out of just experiential learning and observation. Can you just talk about maybe one or two things that you have learned these last couple months that you're most proud of?
Well, I would say I'm thankful for my background. I'm thankful for the foundation of caring that my mother and father put upon me, because I've been doing a lot outside of my job. And, you know, I think to the question you asked earlier, as far as how we can, you know, stimulate our faculty of color, a lot of times our activities that we do to support causes like this are not considered in the same way that, you know, things you would do for tenure or the, you know, the academic advancement process. So understanding the importance of, you know, participating in SB Home, or the fact that, you know, I had to have Zoom meetings with my African American students and with my white students, you know, just dealing with this. And, you know, just having the capacity to do that, I've been very thankful for that. The capacity has been generated by the understanding that, you know, helping others is feeding your own fountain of youth. So I think that it's energized me. So I'm thankful of that foundation that I thought was there, that I found out was in fact there, because what happens under moments of duress sort of is who you are. So I really appreciate that foundation that my parents gave me. As far as skill sets that I've had to develop, I mean, I've always been a communicator. You know, being an African American, we have to operate and do under less than optimal circumstances all the time. So the pandemic was just yet another example of not optimal circumstances. And because of that, you know, I was able to step up. You know, in our culture, you have to be a person that has to use every instrument or tool in the room as part of communication. So with telemedicine, which has emerged as a big part of how we've maintained the practice of medicine, thank God that I'm a good communicator and been able to use those communication skills to continue to engage my patient population through telemedicine. Because even with the pandemic, hypertension is still there, diabetes is still there, and other chronic medical illnesses that, unfortunately, because people have not been able to get to the doctors, these illnesses have not been managed. So I have been fortunate to be in positions both at work and outside of work where I could get that message across to our community, because as it was stated earlier, there's been an issue with the information that comes to our community, and there's been a significant amount of distrust. You know, I look at one of the first things that came with the pandemic, which was black folks don't get coronavirus. And that may have put everybody in a place of ignorance for about a month in the beginning. And a month of waiting or not being ready for the coronavirus puts you tremendously behind the 8 ball. So again, what I recognize with that, and because I have a voice that individuals listen to, I willingly participated. Look, Judy, when you just had the white coats for Black Lives Matter, I was working Saturday. I had a complicated patient and hurried over to come to the hospital and do that. And again, it wasn't a problem. It wasn't a problem at all, because this is a cause that I am passionate about. So I am thankful for recognizing or still seeing that that compassionate person is within me, as I always knew it was, and that my parents raised. So I'm very thankful for that. I am thankful for the survival of being an African American, because it's taught me how to continue to pivot when times present obstacles that you got to deal with. And I'm just trying to teach that ability to pivot to my students. I'm trying to teach that compassion to my colleagues, because again, these issues that we're talking about today, as you know, Zebulon just mentioned, we had a similar circumstance 100 years ago, and it doesn't seem like we learned a bit from it. So again, how do we teach our colleagues, who this is not the easiest conversation to have, to acknowledge a blind spot that they may have?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to thank my panelists, the listeners, and the viewers for being here today to help to hear about Stony Brook's Diversity Action Plan and so much more in this episode of Beyond the Expected podcast, where there are so many terrible occurrences to think about and hardships to endure. I see hope as well. I see it in our communities all around us, and having our voice to be heard, and you've heard voices today. I see it right here at Stony Brook with like-minded institutions striving to lift up education, knowledge, and workplace development in diverse, equitable, and inclusive environments. Thank you again for joining us today and being part of the continuing conversation. It's been my pleasure.